Welcome back, students. Now we're going to turn our attention to Book 2, Chapter 3 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I'm sure that you've already seen that there are lots of ways to go wrong interpreting him, but when you get him right, there are a lot of deep and profound ideas. I've pointed out before that his literary and oratorial style is such that he will return to a previous idea that he had built up. He brings it back. We can call that a reprise. He reprises an idea, and then he looks at it from a new perspective to develop a greater richness to the content of that idea. This is true in Book 2, Chapter 3 as well. He returns to his previous notion of to be is to do. Remember, what he had meant by that was what we actually are is how we actually behave. Our behavior determines what we are, and we can't say, well, I'm a good person but I do a lot of evil acts, or I'm an evil person but I do a lot of good acts. To be is to do. Okay, now, having said that, it would be perfectly legitimate to conclude that to be a good person, you have to do good things. And Aristotle agrees with that entirely, but that's not the total story. Not only do we have to do good actions, but there are 3 side constraints that also have to be satisfied for that action to be virtuous. The first side constraint is that we have to know that it's the right thing. There has to be an awareness, a self-consciousness or knowledge that I'm doing the right thing. So it's not simply that I have to do this proper action, I have to do the action and I have to know that it's the right thing. But that's not enough. That action also has to be done out of free choice, free will. So that I have to do the right thing, be aware that I'm doing it, and it also has to be my choice. I'm not being compelled or forced into that action by someone else. Finally, the third side constraint is that the action has to come from a state of character. What does that mean? The action cannot be an isolated behavior, an isolated action. It has to come from a general disposition. I have to be disposed to act that way. What do we call these dispositions in English? A habit. I have to do that action as part of an ongoing habit for it to be a virtue. Okay, now, let's take an example here that would not have been available to Aristotle, but I think will resonate with my modern audience here. Let's take designated driving and driving drunk. Let's say that we go out to a restaurant and everybody gets drunk except for one person. And that one person drives everyone home. Okay, now that's the action. The sober person driving the drunken people home. That itself, though, is not a virtue, and it does not reflect on the character of the person unless they also know that it's the right action, that they've done it out of free will, and that they've done it out of a disposition or habit or character trait. Think about it like this. let's suppose that the designated driver, the sober driver, drives everybody home successfully, but what they believe is that driving them home in a crazy, reckless, risky fashion would have been better, so that the person doesn't know that they did the right thing. They can't be counted as virtuous, and that action cannot be counted as virtuous. Let's say, though, that they do know that that's the right thing, but they don't want to do it. They would choose to get drunk themselves, but they freely choose to remain sober. Okay, now knowledge and the free choice and the action, you put those together and it still does not rise to the level of virtue. What's left? Well, maybe that previous scenario was the only time that that person ever drove a bunch of drunks home in a sober fashion. It was a completely isolated action. Then it's not going to be a virtuous action. But if that driver consistently, time after time after time, is disposed to driving the others home safely in a sober state, then that person has formed a habit, a character trait, a disposition. And with all of those side constraints together, then we can say that the action of driving the drunken members of the dinner party home is a virtuous action. That's the basic detail that he adds in chapter 3. Now, doesn't this raise an issue that has possibly been already filtering through your mind, this notion of a character trait and habit? What is that all about? Character trait and habit in ancient Greek, actually there's two words for it, but one of them is ethos, and that's intimately connected to the word ethics. What we see there is that ethics is intimately connected to the habits that we have, right? It's engineered right into the language, at least in ancient Greek. For Aristotle, this is obvious. Your habits are your character traits, and that's going to determine whether you're a good or bad person. But what is the exact precise relationship between a virtue and character? That is what he wants to discuss in Book 2, Chapter 4, the next book, chapter. So let's turn our attention to Book 2, Chapter 4. Here, what Aristotle does is to deliver an argument that a logic teacher like myself would call a disjunctive syllogism. In everyday English, we call this process of elimination. Either A or B or C, not A, not B, therefore C. He's going to use that kind of argumentation form in this chapter. And Aristotle, besides being the father of biology, the father of botany, the father of zoology, he's also the father of logic in Western civilization. Here you get a beautiful example of that. The first premise of his argument is that virtue is either an emotion or a faculty or a state of character. Virtue is either A or B or C. Virtue is either an emotion, a faculty, or a state of character. Then he eliminates two of them. He starts off by eliminating virtue as an emotion. Virtue is not just another emotion along with the others. So it's not like there's anger, envy, hope, faith, friendliness, and virtue. It's not an emotion. And yet, there's a grain of truth that it's connected to emotion. Virtue is not identical to emotion, but there's a strong connection. What will that be? Here's the connection. No emotion by itself is ever either good, absolutely good, or absolutely evil. Emotions in moderation are good. Emotions in extremes are bad, morally wrong, evil. Virtue is a moderator of emotion. Put it even more simply, virtue is moderate emotion and action. So it connects to emotion, but it isn't just one emotion among many, it is the moderator of our emotions. And so for Aristotle, anger is not something that's inherently evil, but too little anger is evil and too much anger is evil. What is good anger? Moderate anger. And that may not be satisfying right now to you, but we'll go into that expounded in detail later, and I think it will be a really rather attractive notion to you later. But we've eliminated the possibility that virtue is an emotion. Maybe virtue is a faculty, a capacity. Maybe I have the capacity to be virtuous. And that's all virtue is just potential. He rules that out entirely. To be virtuous is to actively be virtuous, is to turn that capacity into action by energy, by training and energy, turning all of our activities into a proper behavior. So it goes beyond just the potential, it's an actuality. Virtue has to be an actuality, not a potential. So I can't say, well, I could be virtuous, therefore I am virtuous. That's a ridiculous chain of inference. I may as well argue I could be a chemical engineer, therefore I am a chemical engineer. The truth is, anybody could become a chemical engineer, but what would that take? Training, hard work, the formation of habits as an engineer and as a chemist. Only with the formation of those habits do you become a chemical engineer. So a virtue can't be a mere capacity, it has to be a capacity that's turned into an actuality by habit. So we've eliminated those two possibilities. Virtue is not an emotion, virtue is not a faculty. The only thing that's left is that virtue is a state of character. Well, okay, this is what we've been worried about the whole time, talking about character. That's suspicious, at least to the modern mind, isn't it? Oh, we don't like moral terms. So the idea of moral character seems to be anathema to us, poison. That's something we don't want to talk about. Aristotle, though, goes deeply into character. What it is to have a personality is character formation. How do we form our characters? By habit. But what character type is virtue? Is it just any character type? That can't be right, because some character types are vicious. What makes a character a virtuous character and not a vicious character? Here's the link that he establishes in this chapter. To be virtuous is to be in a state of character where you aim at moderation. It's the character trait of being moderate. Extreme character traits, extreme characters, extreme personalities are vicious. They're morally wrong. Or to put it in a loaded term, evil. So let's go back to the chain of inference I'd started earlier, and now we're going to add a link. Aristotle wants us to lead the moral life. The moral life is the good life. The good life is the happy life. The happy life is the life of virtue. The life of virtue is the rational life. And now what we've learned is that the rational life is the life of moderation. To be rational is the character trait of tending towards moderation, of being disposed to being moderate. Well, how can he say that? Isn't that just him flying off the handle, subjectively imposing on us his value judgments? No. It's his empirical observation. He says, look around the way that the world works. Moderation succeeds, extremes fail. If he's wrong about that, then the entire ethical theory falls to the ground like a house of cards. But he's willing to stick with that observation that when you're moderate, you succeed and you're excellent, and when you're extreme, you fail and you're morally evil. So what we got out in chapter 4 then is that virtue is a moral state of character in which we are disposed towards moderation. Very good. Now let's go yet a step further in chapter 5 of Book 2. Once again, his literary and oratorical style of a reprise back to an important idea that he now observes from a different perspective to add richness. He's going to return to this idea of virtue as being excellence in a function. And we're going to take that a step further. He reminds us what we meant by excellence in a function. And he turns to the example of an eyeball. Okay, what's the unique function of an eyeball? Well, it's to help you see. Isn't it clear, though, that some eyes are good and some eyes are bad? A good eye is one that functions properly and helps you see well. And a bad eye is one that doesn't help you see well and harms your or lessens your vision. Similarly with horse racing, you could have lots of horses, lots of race horses. Their unique function is to run races, but some race horses are better race horses than other race horses. The racehorse that fulfills its function, wins the prize, is the excellent racehorse. It's the virtuous racehorse, again in a general non-moral sense. But in the human example, in the human case, virtue has to be in a moral sense. What is it that's our unique function? We said before it was active rationality. So human virtue has to be excellence in active rationality, not simply being actively rational, but being great at it, excelling at it. Okay, now, we'd said just a moment ago that rationality is the character trait of aiming towards moderation. At this point now we get a new perspective with some rich detail. We're going to call moderation aiming towards a mean, M-E-A-N. And what Aristotle does here is to distinguish two types of mean, an absolute mean and a relative mean. An absolute mean is what we can think of as an arithmetic mean. It's a point equally distant between two other points. So I could say, what is the mean, the arithmetic or absolute mean, between 2 and 10? The absolute mean between 2 and 10 is 6. 6 is the equally distant point from 2 and from 10. You and I, as rational beings, can calculate that. If there's some controversy, we can calculate it, and we'll eventually all agree that the absolute mean between 2 and 10 is 6. But there's another sense of the word mean that is relative. And in this sense of the word mean, what we mean is the proper amount. And it won't be the same for everybody, and it may not be able to be calculated by anybody other than ourselves. Here, let's take the example of food, which was Aristotle's example. How much is the proper amount of meat in our diets? Here, what we're asking is, what is the mean for meat in our diets? It's not an absolute amount. The proper amount of meat in my diet might be radically different than the proper amount of meat for your diet. So we can't say, well, it's exactly, 6 pounds of meat per week or something like that. It is not a quantified, absolute number. Maybe I need a lot more protein than you do, so I need a lot more meat. Or maybe I'm a lot less active than you are, so I need less protein, less meat in my diet. The proper amount of meat in my diet is not the same as yours. Fairly obvious point. He turns to gymnastics, and Aristotle fits in with Plato and Socrates before him, using trainers, athletic trainers, as a common example. In gymnastics, how much is the proper amount of exercise? It might be radically different from you to me, and the athletic trainer is the one who knows how to determine the proper amount of exercise in an athlete's regimen. Maybe I need a lot more push-ups than you do in my activity. Or maybe you need a lot more sit-ups than I do in your gymnastic activity. So we're going to train differently. That's a relative mean. It's not subjective, but it's relative to the person. Now, every art or science works properly by aiming at that mean. And so, rationality, when we excel at it, when we are virtuous in our rationality, we are able to correctly determine what the mean is, what the relative mean is for things in our lives. Oh my goodness, you can see a lot of application here. What's the proper amount of alcohol in your life? It may be different than the proper amount of alcohol in my life. Maybe for some people, the proper amount of alcohol is none at all. Maybe other people can socially drink a fair amount and not have it disrupt their lives, and so they can drink, their proper mean is a lot greater than the first person. Rationality ultimately is a tendency, a disposition to move towards the mean, the right amount, and to avoid extremes. Aristotle then, in just one or two sentences, raises this idea to an incredible profundity by talking about skillfulness in life. I guess in our current terminology, we would call these life skills. Aristotle, though, applies this to life as a whole. Isn't there a skill where we can determine the proper amount of things for us in our lives? And so moderation expands out into every part of our life. We become skillful at living. This is what he called skillfulness in life, to be a virtuoso at life, to be an expert at life, to be skilled at life, means to understand the importance of moderation and be able to determine what the point of moderation is, and further, to actually do it, not talk about it, not have it in potential or as a faculty, but to actually be moderate in life. That's a great skill that will help us succeed. And if he's wrong about that, Aristotle is willing to scrap the entire project and to go with your observation. But he believes that his observation of the importance of moderation will hold up under scrutiny. So virtue is aiming at the mean, and what it does is to employ eupraxia, E-U-P-R-A-X-I-A, eupraxia, good deeds, we might translate it as, or good actions, good activity. Virtue, what it does is to take all of our energy, all of our energia, all of our activity, to impose training, impose discipline on us to the point where, as a character trait, we become moderate. Aristotle says that extremes are criticized in life and moderation is praised, and he takes that to be confirmation of his observation. Look around. Who do we praise? People who hit the right proper amount in what they were doing. Who do we criticize and condemn? Extremists. So that shows that moderation is the point that rationality has to aim at, just like an archer aims at the bullseye. Moderation is the bullseye that we have to aim at. We have to get better and better at it. Eupraxia is hitting the bullseye, and that doesn't come with the first time that you shoot a bow and arrow. It's going to take a lot of practice, lots of mistakes, lots of refinement in our aim and in our technique. But that's what life is. Life demands training. Life demands increased discipline, just like athletics does. Hitting the mean, Aristotle says, is difficult, and few do it. missing the bullseye altogether is not hard. It's easy, and that's what most people do. If we can use archery as a metaphor for life, and Aristotle does this constantly, very few archers are good archers. Most archers are bad. So, again, we get this tragic view that what we should all be doing is aiming and hitting the bullseye, but very few of us do it. A tragic view of life, but we cannot reject it just because it's tragic. We have to ask, is it true? And Aristotle's very confident that you'll find that to be true.